By now I think you know the drill, right? We just take a few moments, let it sink in. What kind of future are you imagining for yourselves? What kind of present are you imagining for yourselves? Are we all imagining for ourselves? We've gotten a bleak picture of how conservation can also end up harming the people that it claims to be helping, right? But it's not all gloom and doom, as our next speaker will show us. Joseph Gary, who is a senior policy advisor, will be speaking about the opportunities that are there for local communities to take part, to be the drivers of conservation. Please help me welcome Joseph on stage.
Thank you. No need.
You don't need it.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Exactly 20 years ago, on these dates, but that was late last century, I was inside indigenous territories in Amazonia, in the Curaray River, the homeland of the Sasha-Runa. We have some representatives here. I was doing research on indigenous knowledge and also on the indigenous movements to protect their forest. But indigenous knowledge was not only about proficiency in biodiversity, in ecosystem management. It was also about social and policy innovations that the indigenous peoples, the Sasha-Runa, were scoping. We're trying to generate development alternatives, or if you wish, alternatives to development, to confront the threat from monoculture farming, from oil exploitation. They were creating a package of legal, institutional, organizational systems. They had a robust, solid political organization. They had enacted territorial bylaws. They have drawn development plans that would conform to the current sustainable development goals. They also had established a center for research on wildlife farming, an Inuit botanical park. They had agroforestry programs. They had ecotourism programs. They even had an Amazon platform for science and technology to blend different knowledge systems to better conserve and use the forest for sustainable development. I was enlightened by the depth of their knowledge and the political vision this nurtured. But at that time, this knowledge and this vision had no institutional status in mainstream society. They had no political gateways to move this ahead. When years later, in 2008, I was given the opportunity to coordinate a new international initiative in the Democratic Republic of Congo to help the country to govern sustainable their forests, I immediately thought of the Congo indigenous peoples and forest communities, and on the vitality of the knowledge and the vision they probably had. At that time, the DRC, which has the second largest rainforest in the world, was a leading nation in the negotiations for a new financial instrument that could support and recognize countries that address the problems of deforestation. This is not REDD+, and it's basically connecting the conservation of the forest with climate finance to trigger pathways for sustainable development. At the same time, in the UN, we set up a new platform precisely to help advance this new initiative, UN REDD, connecting forests with climate finance, helping countries to think in a transformational way. The DRC government called on UN REDD to help them harness the opportunities of climate finance to govern the forest more sustainably. we convened with government that this process had to be participatory because it had to integrate the knowledge, the perspectives of indigenous peoples and local communities. I can assure you, I can tell you that the first stakeholder assemblies we did were a monumental clash between government and indigenous peoples, with plenty of grievance. To start with, government, just 10 years ago, would not recognize there were indigenous peoples in the country, let alone recognize any rights over the forest. But with some diplomatic methods and a lot of passion, we managed to move ahead a policy dialogue. What was important here was climate finance, which was a facilitator of multi-stakeholder dialogue and looking at common agenda. It was not an easy task. But I remember clearly how indigenous peoples would insist once again that the critical measure for the forest was to find and to establish adequate and equitable policies and reforms for the land and for tenure. And they insisted, and they brought to the meetings in the capital all their territorial cartography, all their knowledge on how they manage the forest. The process advanced. It engaged more than 1,000 people, from civil servants to representatives from indigenous peoples, from local environmental activists to members of parliament. In 2012, the government adopted the national strategy for REDD+, at the Council of Ministers, chaired by the President of the Republic, enacting it as a sort of a state policy. The country established a national fund for REDD+, which so far has mobilized around $200 million, which are implementing precisely a land use policy program and a tenure reform, as well as several other investment programs in the field. The rights of indigenous peoples and local communities to land and forest are an integral component of this process. In addition, there is now a law on indigenous peoples at Parliament for discussion. The challenges ahead are enormous, but there are significant policy innovations at stake. And what needs to be recognized, what the country owes to indigenous peoples, is that the engagement of the knowledge, the visions, the struggle of indigenous peoples in DRC allow the national policy to be more transformational and to receive climate finance at such a high scale. Without indigenous knowledge, neither the policy would be transformational nor climate finance would have arrived at such a scale. Let me comment on another example. There are not many, but there is a tie that hopefully we can all build up. Colombia. Colombia has also tried to connect indigenous knowledge with policy work with the prospects of climate finance. In year 2015, just during the Paris Agreement negotiations, the government of Colombia signed an agreement with 3 European donors, Germany, Norway, and the UK, for an agreement, a Forest for Climate agreement, which would provide finance at the scale of $200 million against a set of policy milestones related to the sustainable governance of lands and forests. Immediately after, the government, with the support of UN REDD and other actors, embarked on preparing a strategy that would allow them to unlock this opportunity. And government decided to mobilize indigenous knowledge to build this strategy. A new platform of different stakeholders, a political platform to discuss forest, climate, and reforms was established. And all the indigenous knowledge came from a rich network of institutions. In total, there were 5 national indigenous unions involved, 6 territorial organizations of the Afro-Colombian people, 2 campesino organizations, more than 30 associations of indigenous people from the Pacific, from the Caribbean, from the Amazon, 40 community councils of the Afro-Colombian people. All that created a critical mass and produced a strategy which was adopted by government and registered officially at the UN Climate Convention. What it is very interesting to note in this strategy is the title. This national policy is entitled Forest Territories for Life. I think you have noticed that I have insisted slightly on the word territory, because this is part of the indigenous political language. Therefore, there are opportunities with adequate approaches in which the indigenous political philosophy can permeate national policy. And the result, actually, are policies that are more robust, more credible, and that can attract the climate finance that many countries need to enhance their pathways for sustainable development. But not everything is easy. With the new government last year, this strategy lost traction. And actually, deforestation started to increase in Colombia in the last few months. But this strategy had the critical mass of indigenous knowledge and visions and proposals. And it has proved to be resilient. Early this year, when the government had to adopt the National Development Plan, which is a critical policy instrument in Colombia, because it's going to give the framework for every presidential cycle, and needs to be approved as a law by Parliament, and needs to be consulted again, according to the law. When the government went to indigenous peoples to discuss the draft National Development Plan, indigenous peoples used the forest strategy to revise and enhance the plan and to negotiate their endorsement. Without their endorsement, the National Development Plan could not have become law. And this plan became law not even a month ago. And it's showing how the integration of knowledge can have catalytic effects in the policy process at national level. In fact, recently, the European donors of the Forest for Climate Financial Agreement have precisely expressed that the National Forest Strategy is the basic policy framework to advance on this agreement and on the associated knowledge. So DRC and Colombia is just the pioneer examples of the ways to do policy in the era of sustainable development. By connecting stakeholders, by connecting different knowledge systems, policies are much more innovative, are much more transformational, and can catalyze finance at scale. Humanity is facing this century tremendous environmental emergencies, the climate crisis, the tragedy of deforestation, the need to restore so many ecosystems, the need to make agricultural and landscape sustainable. There is clearly the need for a major pact between people and the planet. I don't mean a written pact necessarily, but a new configuration of mindsets, of economic and social relationships, of knowledge systems, of policy innovations. For that, indigenous knowledge is clearly a catalyst. Many years ago, indigenous peoples were in a movement for territorial rights. But actually, what was that about was a forerunner of this pact between people and planet. They wanted to have territorial rights to test. We are going to need the forest to test and demonstrate that this pact can happen. And we need indigenous knowledge and the associated indigenous rights to make this happen. To conclude, let me tell you, as you already know, indigenous knowledge doesn't belong to the past. It can actually help nations to drive to the future. A future of sustainability in which the forests can be preserved so they can sustain the local livelihoods and our global climate. Thank you very much.